probably my favorite Torah portion in the entire Torah, for the simple fact that it's named after me. Um,
Oh,
Oh,
boo.
Oh,
Come on, I get to make that joke once a year, but they spelled it wrong.
Oh, boo.
we're chuckling. We're chuckling.
Right. That's, I think, what they call a groaner, right? But in all seriousness, it's a Torah portion that I love because this is we're getting now into. I think I said a couple weeks ago that the whole the narrative the narrative of Joseph and his brothers is actually, I think, one of if not the longest kind of narrative arc in all the Torah, and certainly a very rich and interesting one. But I think maybe a close second is that which began in earnest a week or two ago, but really starts this week, which is this the Exodus story that we know so well, that we retell every year at Pesach at our Seder tables, and the drama between Moses and Pharaoh, and then everything that ensues. And that really gets off to a start this week with Moses approaching Pharaoh and the beginning of the first couple plagues. Because in some ways we're living, I think, in a world that sometimes feels pretty plagued at the moment. I thought we'd focus on one of those plagues in particular, which is the plague of darkness, because I think it's one, particularly when we get into the text and the commentaries in a few minutes, when we get into the way that the rabbis understand this plague of darkness. I think it's a little different actually than the way most of us imagine it, because I think many of us imagine it sort of, like nighttime. Right? If you think about it, okay, there's a plague of darkness. So it's just like night for a while. It's kind of like living in, the very top of the northern hemisphere where for part of the year, the sun never comes out. I remember, just as a quick anecdote, as a kid, one of my father's best friends is Finnish, lives in Finland. And he would come visit us and tell these stories about what it was like to live someplace where it's dark 24 hours a day, part of the year. And likewise, light 24 hours a day, part of the year. And I remember being 7, 8, 9 years old and not being able to imagine what it would be like to not see the sun for days on end, much less weeks on end, or months in some cases. And so I think, at least for me, that's kind of how I always thought about or imagined the plague of darkness, which sounds pretty bad and pretty depressing, right? There's major issues of depression in places where the sun doesn't come out for long periods of time, literally, not places like Seattle. But that's not quite the way the rabbis understand it. So we're going to get into that today. All right. I'm going to share my screen with some text. Okay. It's a little bit bigger.
could that be alluded to the 500 years of when they didn't have the Enlightenment? And then we had that period in history.
Yeah. I mean, I think metaphorically, certainly, I think that's some of
That's
the.
what I mean.
Right? Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, right, there's the whole idea of, I think, darkness of mind, as it were, or intellect, for sure.
Right.
And I think that's where, I'm by no means an etymologist, but I think that, the term enlightenment, I'm sure if we did a little bit of digging, it's not so hard or to fathom, comes from, I'm sure, something connected with the idea of light, right? And bringing light to our minds. Great point, Karen. Also, just to underscore, mostly familiar faces, but some new faces, at least to me. I usually say this when I begin teaching. From my perspective, I'm someone who doesn't believe there's a such thing as an interruption, or a tangent for that matter. I like both of those things, so please don't be shy. Unmute we're all grown-ups. I just came from teaching first grade. When they unmute themselves and say something, it's a disaster. Not the case in our group, so feel free to unmute yourself or drop something in the chat if that's easier also, if there's something you want to share. Okay, so everybody can see the text up here? Okay. Try not to read ahead. We're going to go one text at a time. We're going to start with text number 1, which is the 2 verses from pretty much not quite the very beginning, but close to the beginning of our Torah portion. I'll read these, and then other people hopefully will volunteer as we make our way through. God says to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the heavens, that there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt." And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. All right. What do you make of this? Any thoughts, reactions, anything? Doesn't seem, you know, I don't know, as expected? Observations?
Rabbi,
Yes, I'm just trying to scroll through so I can see everybody. Yes, go ahead, Miriam.
what I understand about this darkness, which was explained to me, was not the darkness that we experienced in Finland, because I was also there, and even in Norway, it gets dark about, I don't know, it's dark very, very early. And this is a darkness, they said, which did not have light, because even in those countries, we had light coming from the sky. There was light coming from different sources. Even at night, when you turn off all your lights, there's still light coming into your house from windows and other sources, even though it's dark outside. But this kind of darkness was where you could not see anything. You could not see ahead of you, and you could not see anything around you. And so they said that people could not see themselves, meaning they did not feel for each other.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't see inside of each other. They didn't see another human being.
Yes, yes, we're going to get there and past there, absolutely, in just a second, right? I think what sticks out to me here, right, is this idea of it being a thick darkness. The idea that it's a darkness that you can feel, right? Because I think we think of darkness as being something that affects our eyes, right? Not our other senses of touch, right? But the idea that it's a darkness that is thick, that actually has weight, that is palpable, I think begins to paint this picture of something that's a little bit more than, just nighttime.
I'm just thinking it's like emotional darkness.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, it's thick and it's heavy,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
also, what does it do to your head when you're in the dark like that?
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking, is that it's more of a, when you think, if you feel darkness, it's a melancholy, it's almost a depression. It's it's an internal.
Yeah.
sensation.
And look, I think not to make everything about COVID, right? But I think
Yes,
there's a darkness that I think this year has had that some of us feel more than others.
sure.
That everyone, the catchphrase right now is a dark winter, right? With virus numbers. And I think that's, I don't think the rabbis foresaw COVID. I hope not. But I think that some of that too, right? The idea of it being something that is felt, not just seen, right? Jeff, I saw your hand.
Yes. Two points. Number one, before creation, and the way we see the universe now is made of dark matter. And dark matter is ubiquitous throughout the universe. And only God can manipulate light and the dark matter, so to speak. And this last sentence also points to the very essence of why the plagues were presented. And they were more or less just observed by the Israelites in Goshen. And the point is that it is God presenting himself as the ultimate power to the Israelites themselves, as well as the world. That the plagues were the ultimate message that God truly is above nature and beyond. That these plagues were witnessed by the children of Israel and not necessarily affecting them directly.
Right.
But the point is that they observed the power and the essence of their God as it becomes their God.
Great point, Jeff. Absolutely. I think that's exponentially or even underscored by the 10th plague, right? The whole idea right, of the death of the firstborn and the marking on the door, and then God, sparing the firstborn of the Israelites. Someone else that looked like was raising a point before we push it. Okay. I'm going to push us a little further just because it's into this idea.
There's one thing too.
Go ahead, Susan.
Yes, I mean, I agree that the primordial darkness and the darkness of your soul and melancholy, but also death. Isn't darkness death as well?
Yeah.
And that takes over your whole body.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so it's like a Gehenna. It's what it feels like, a taste before you go to Sheol or Gehenna.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to plug Rabbi Leader's newest book, but he reflects on death and life, and on many separate occasions, talks about sort of the darkness that death is, both for the person who dies, I think, metaphorically and obviously, but also for those who mourn. There's a darkness that we're consumed by, that we then come out of, right? We think of the 23rd Psalm, right? And in the valley of shadows, darkness, right?
Can I make one other point?
Yeah, Jeff, go.
Well, I just have one other thing too.
I'm sorry.
The god of the Egyptians was the sun god. So when that is obliterated, then it also says something against the Egyptian gods.
Beautiful.
Basically, I was going to augment her point almost exactly, that all the initial plagues were directly purposed to undermine the standing gods of Israel, be they frogs, be they whatever.
Egypt.
And the god of darkness for Egypt was also the god of their death. Was it Osiris, or no, it had a different name, but the god who oversaw their underworld was also a god of darkness. And every effort that God makes in the plagues is to overcome and minimize and denigrate the ludicrousness of the Egyptian gods, ending in Pharaoh himself. But the idea that, yes. So, I think that's a good point.
Okay, Merle, and then I'm going to go to the next text.
Okay, but quickie. Yeah.
All of a sudden, this came into my mind that, like the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden there's this Big Bang and there's these particles, and are the particles light?
Ooh.
Right, you go into the black hole.
Does that lift the heaviness of the darkness?
Yeah. Yeah.
Suddenly there's some kind of light, whatever that was.
Karen.
Okay, quickie. Just that the last sentence, though, in that says, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Yes. And that means that to me, that even though there was darkness outside, there was hope in their life.
Ooh, beautiful.
They were not dealing even though they were not destroyed.
Yes.
Because their souls they still had the hope in them.
Absolutely. Oh, there's a sermon. Let me know when you finish writing that for me.
Oh, sorry.
Jennifer, I see your hand up, and I saw you nodding when Karen was saying that.
Sorry, yeah, I'm enjoying the comments, are just brilliant. I just wanted to say the other thing could be also that the idea that also what you all were touching on is that the Egyptians had their gods. They also knew how to do some magic, so that these tricks, so that it was nothing big to them that the Nile turned red. They could do that. The serpents were already on their scepters. So, and then the idea of hardening Pharaoh's heart, it might not have been so that he wouldn't acknowledge the bitterness of the slaves and all he was doing, but more hardening his heart towards the supremacy of God, of our God, of the God. So that was where maybe what he was trying to do, until then he could finally accept God is God. That it wasn't necessarily to not.
You want to go out of your slippers?
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh well, yeah.
Carol.
Thank you.
Rabbi, and the discussion is fascinating. Curious point, some things are not just arbitrary. Why 3 days?
Ooh.
In our teaching, we have 4 of many things, 4 tribes, for lots of 4s. But numerically, why 3?
It's a wonderful question to which I have no answer. But I will do a little looking. Look, 3 is also 3 and 7 are both, pretty significant numbers that come up many times. I will look. I don't have. I'm at home, so I don't have where I would take a look at the moment right in front of me. Does anybody have a Chumash in front of them that might have a note on that?
One of the questions that could answer that is that there were periods of darknesses, we have eclipses,
Yeah.
but the fact that this persisted well beyond a astrological event
Right.
gave it significance and importance, that this was beyond nature.
Well, I think as we get into Rashi here in the next text, this may speak to it as well. Not so much why 3, but the idea that it's more than a day, right? Because darkness is a part of every day, right? So we're gonna go to Rashi here on this text. This idea that it's a tactile kind of darkness. Somebody want to read this, the English?
A darkness that can be touched, a darkness more dark than the dark of night. The dark of night darker still. The word translated as touch is really a form of the word to grow dark. Ankelos takes the word to be from, to move away. This he translates darkness upon the land of Egypt after the darkness of night has departed. A darkness that would begin at dawn. But the Hebrew does not say after, it says and. The Midrash takes this verb to be from, to grow, indicating that the darkness was so thick it was doubled and redoubled until it became a darkness of substance, mamash.
Mamash, which means like, all the most, all of it. Right. So the 2 pieces here that stick out to me, and then I would love to hear from everybody else. One is this idea that, right, it's the dark. It underscores the idea that it's the darkness that is during what would be the day, right? And so back to the idea of the 3 days, I think the fact that this lasted, for more than just a day, kind of underscores the all-consuming nature of it, right? That it's beyond what is normative and would be expected. And again, this idea that it's so substantive, right, is the word Rashi uses. Any other thoughts to this? Reactions to this? Yeah, Joy. You're muted, Joy.
Thank you. Please tell me, I heard a
Yeah.
story about this darkness, and I want to ask all of you what you think of it. It had to do with the darkness was coming, and all the people were very fearful, and it was seen as a hindrance to the people not to move forward. They were frightened, but Moses was not frightened, and he walked into the darkness, and there he found God.
Huh.
I heard that from a rabbi the other day. I wish I could quote it.
It's just interesting. That sounds vaguely familiar to me. I've heard that as well somewhere.
It was a subject about mindfulness and hindrance that keeps one from moving forward to moving on, or to. And it just had a lot of meaning. That I just want to say this to you. This young poet the other day, Amanda Gorman.
Oh, she was
I
fabulous.
just want to say that we all know somewhere in her past she had a speech impediment. And to me, she walked through the hindrance. And this reminds me of Moses and the shadow, the darkness. Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Jennifer and then Jeff.
Oh, just wanted to say what a contrast between you can't go near Hashem, right? You can't look, you can't touch. And the darkness is such a contradiction in every other way to be able to physically touch it.
Right.
So that you've got these two overwhelming forces, one of darkness and one of good, and they're different in every way.
Well, yeah, and I'm thinking about, right, with whatever, 2 weeks ago, the beginning of Shemot of Exodus, right? God presenting God's self to Moses, right, with fire, and which is light in the burning bush, right? Again, this contrast to the darkness. Yeah, Jeff.
If we believe the concept that the plagues represented the nullification of the Egyptian gods, the god Ra, the sun god itself, is the ultimate god of Egypt. And the ability of God to create darkness and nullify their preeminent religious icon, God, just reinforces for their people his ability to really represent himself as the true creator and the true power. And what is the first thing he does in Genesis? He creates the sun and secondarily the moon. So he is in charge. He is the ultimate creator, the ultimate source of light and darkness.
Right.
And overcomes again their ultimate Egyptian deity, Ra.
Rabbi, can I focus on a different section where it talks about they saw not one another?
Yes.
That these people then are wrapped in their interiority. Their sense of community and relationship with others is fractured during this darkness.
Yes.
And that is, that is a plague. That is a horrible state to be in.
We're in it.
Absolutely, Brad. I would, if I didn't know better, I would say that you had read down to a few texts that we haven't put up on the screen yet, because that's exactly where we're going to go. So I'm going to put a pin in that for just a second, but keep that thought right there.
Eloquent.
Well,
Susan.
I have an answer to the, or something to the question that was raised before, why 3? Etz Chaim says it's a literary structure. It doesn't go further than that it's an architecture to show that these events are not random, that they actually occur in this particular pattern. And it goes deeper, and I can't follow all of it, but it's the whole pattern of when Moses appears before the Pharaoh, when the Pharaoh is out in the river, out towards the river or in his palace, and when Aaron appears before the Pharaoh, and it's to show that there is a structure. It's a literary device, and that the 10th comes all of a sudden. And and the various things, some have warnings, some don't. So there's a whole kind of real structure to it. But why they did it in 3s, I can't. You almost think of the Trinity, but that's not our stuff. It's, belongs to another.
Just something I'll say in relationship to what I think Jeff was saying, and Jennifer, I see your hand up, was this idea, think of the words of the priestly blessing, right? May God's light shine upon you, right? Light is absolutely, a piece of God's presence. Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, the idea that, and thank you, Brad, that was another eloquent expression. The idea that the people were distanced from each other because, in any dictatorship, which the Pharaoh was, people are very, if any of you have Eastern European friends or anyone who's lived under a dictatorship, nobody talks, because nobody knows on whose side is who. And then the other thing is that just strikes me, I'll just put it out there and then take us where you will, is Pharaoh doesn't ever say, well, you could do that. Oh my gosh, you raised frogs. Well, then I'm going to create this, or, oh, and would bring up a something of his own, but he doesn't do that. He just doesn't let the people go.
Miriam, go ahead.
I'm very grateful to Brad. Hi, Brad. I'm Miriam. because you used a wonderful word that is not used very much. And I find it very operative and will, with your permission, use it. And the word is interiority. They were so into their interiority that they could not even see. And my feeling is, even if it were light, because of their megalomaniac interiority, which we had for 4 years, that this person was unable to see anybody else but himself. Even if it were light all around him, he didn't have the ability to see anyone else. Period. I'm through.
Right. I think it's a great point that that's a whole other kind of darkness, which we're speaking about in a way at the beginning, which is,
Yes.
darkness that is not.
And a darkness that could end up being harmful to others.
Yes.
It's that kind of a darkness.
Absolutely. Let's look at Rambam here on this verse about people not seeing each other and the 3 days. The Rambam says that this darkness was not merely the absence of sunlight, so that the sun set and it was as dark as night, but it was a thick darkness, as we've said, that it was a dense fog that descended from the sky. This darkness extinguished every light, just as in deep mines and other places of intense darkness no light can exist. Similarly, those who cross the mountains of darkness find that they cannot keep a light or any kind of fire burning. If this were not so in our verse, then they could simply have used lamps. But it was not merely that daylight was absent, but that darkness was sent. It may be that such a dense fog could actually be physically felt, as our sages said, like the Atlantic fogs mentioned by Ibn Ezra, right? There's the question that we're here, almost 40 minutes in and no one's asked. Well, why didn't the Egyptians light lamps?
But they're saying here it cannot keep a light or any kind of fire burning. And it almost sounds like a lack of oxygen. I mean, if you want to get scientific or whatever, it's almost like everything was sucked out of the light's existence, because without water and oxygen, how can you exist?
Yeah. There's no ability, no space, no oxygen, as you put it. Jeff.
I'm sorry, did you call me?
Oh yeah, I saw a hand up. No.
Okay. Well, let me save that for now. Why don't you proceed? I'm sorry.
Back to you. Okay. We're gonna keep going just in the interest of time. Right. So this is Exodus Rabbah. Anybody want to take a stab at this? We can do the English.
I will. What is the meaning of thick darkness? Rabbi Mimi of Haifa said, Rabbi Abdimi. The darkness was doubled and redoubled. Our sages taught there were 7 days of darkness. During the first 3 days, one was sitting and wished to stand, could do so, and one who stood could sit down if he wished. Concerning these days, does it say, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days, and they saw not one another. During the last 3 days, he who sat could not stand up, he who stood could not sit down, and he who was lying down could not raise himself upright. And concerning these days, it says, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. And there's the architecture of 3 again.
Right. I think, I don't know about others. What first comes to mind for me in this commentary, I think, is actually the, not so much the physical darkness, but the emotional darkness that we were sort of touching on earlier, right? Which is that idea, and again, not to keep coming back to Steve's book, but, one of the images that he conjures is this idea that grief is like waves and it knocks you down and you can't get up, and eventually you can. And I think that's maybe just because I was reading it, last week, but that's one of the things that comes to mind with me here is that whether it's grief, whether it's, emotional pain, whether it's just kind of feeling glum. There's that feeling oftentimes of sort of not being able to move, not being able to do.
Think about the psychological effects. Not only do you have the fear of the event, but you're literally paralyzed and can take no actions. Can you imagine how that magnifies that internal fear, dread, and perceived threat?
Yep. Look, I think, Jeff, that's what, and again, to come back to COVID, I think that, was what's for some of us, so challenging about, a global pandemic is that other than the little things we can do, masks and hand washing and vaccines, all these things, in the big picture, it's not really in our individual control.
And yet there's no place to run.
Right.
The entire world is over. There's no alternative. There is no escape.
Just like the darkness, there's no escaping it.
That's right.
Except I want to play the opposite game. And I want to say that it depends upon, and I don't want to sound arrogant in any way, but it depends upon the strength of the individual to be able to overcome that which confronts them in life. And it's just like the bamboo. It is, it both plays its strength and it both plays its flexibility. And I think that therein lies, to be simplistic, the men from the boys, and that how we live life, because there is no such thing as the perfect straight line in life. And we're always going to have detours, and we're always going to have something thrown in our path. And it depends upon how we meet it and how we can rise up above it or endure it, be it an illness or as long as you're not totaled. And that's.
Karen, what about the women and the balabustas? Don't just use men. I mean, don't be sexist here.
I'm sorry. It's my generation.
No, but Karen, you're 100% right. And it dovetails with the comment you made earlier about, there being light, despite the darkness, there being light in the homes of the Israelites. That is that light, within them and within each of us, that when darkness visits us, as it does for all of us, we summon the light that is within us to bring.
It doesn't mean you have to be in denial.
Correct.
But you can face something, but you also can move on through it.
Absolutely.
I have something to say. It struck me that this darkness is also night, isn't it? And we speak of nightmares. I mean, Fuseli has a representation of a nightmare, which is a incubus coming down to a recumbent woman who's having these nightmares. But don't we say something too, that the soul, when we wake up, thank you for returning my soul to me. Yeah. So you had, and this is what I just thought, you have this sense of not only sleep, but potentially, well, as I said before, death and a loss of the soul. And it's only when the light comes in the morning that you can say, thank you, God.
Exactly.
Returning my soul to me.
Are you an art person, by the way?
Because a retired art person. Yes.
Because I heard your allusion. Well, the reason why I said that is because of your marvelous allusion to Fuseli.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece called Nightmare.
Yes, I understand.
No, but Susan, it's beautiful, right? This idea about Susan's referring, for those who aren't familiar, that the rabbis imagine that death, that sleep is a fraction of death, and that when we sleep, that our soul departs our body and has adventures, and those are our dreams, good and otherwise, and that at the moment before waking up, the soul sort of sneaks back in, and we wake up. But if it were not to sneak back in, we would not awake from our sleep and we would die.
By the way, that's also in Michelangelo's Dying Slave and his conception of sleep. And the soul, that slave is not really dying, he's asleep and waiting for the soul to return.
And we recite these words, Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'chayam, shehachazarta bi nishmati b'chemla rabba emunatecha, when you wake up, right? Literally thanking God for returning your soul so that you have another day to live. Merle, I saw you had a hand.
Yeah, I think this goes with any fear that, whatever your fears might be, there's a darkness, and coming out of your fear, there's light. I mean, there are things that we all have things we're afraid of somewhere in our life. And that I think once you come out of that fear, or once you, excuse me, recover from that fear, then you kind of feel like there's the light at the end of the tunnel. I can get through this. But I think that darkness, I think we all have fears of some kind. And I think that, we teach our children that they shouldn't be afraid, but their fears are different. They approach their fears differently than we do. So I just kind of feel like this suddenly appears that it fits into any fears too, and how we come out of them. Just like, am I going to wake up in the morning and am I going to be okay? Then, it's the same concept.
Rabbi?
Yes.
When I mentioned before the word hindrance, fear, I'm thinking during all these dark times, please tell me, where was Moses? This might be connected to 101, but was he in the dark too and not able to move? Because I understood that he moved forward. He recognized the fear, the darkness. He moved forward into the darkness and found God. Does that mean anything? Does that sound like any portions?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I think yes. I think it's fair to say that if we're reading the text where it is, which I like to say a lot, that the darkness did not affect, to Jeff's point, the Israelites in the same way that it affected the Egyptians, right? And the fact that the Israelites were sitting at home, presumably with the lights on, right? So that would extend to Moses as well, right? So he has some protexia, as it will, to sort of venture out into the darkness. Yeah, Jennifer.
Oh, the idea, the modani or modani, there's also that thing where then you even wash your hands again because some might have been left even in the fingertips. But what I was going to say is that the whole thing with the plagues is almost like a blueprint, the road to recovery from addiction, where each successive drop, as the addiction lowers the quality of your life, all kinds of things till they hit rock bottom. And the solution is, but you need that higher power and give up whatever you were depending on to bring you happiness with your addictive drug of
substance.
Yeah, that was it.
All right, we're going to move to the next piece here, a little piece of Talmud. Anyone want to read here?
From when does one recite the Shema in the morning? From when one can distinguish between techelet, the sky blue, and white. Rabbi Elazar says, between sky blue and leek green, and finish until sunrise. Rabbi Yehoshua says, until 3 hours of the day, for it is the habit of kings to rise at 3 hours.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there for a second, Jeff. So this is this Mishnah, which then the Gemara, the Talmud elaborates on, is one of the most famous pieces of Mishnah. It's usually what like little kids in yeshiva who are beginning their studies of Mishnah start with. And it's this famous Mishnah of like, what time in the morning when you wake up, what time do you say the morning prayer? What time do you say Shema in the morning? And this idea of when you can distinguish between techelet, the sky blue color, and white, is a reference to, at the time, the way tzitzit on a talit were tied, which was with one of the strings being this techelet color, this sky blue color. It's no longer the custom because the thinking is that the special dye, blue dye that came from these special snails, believe it or not, was lost and can't be found and can't be recreated. But so the illusion is that if it's light enough that you can look at your tzitzit and tell the difference between the white string and the blue string, it's time to say Shema. There's enough light to be able to make that distinction. And then the next piece is this, we wait 3 hours. Okay. So moving on to then what the Gemara says about this. Jeff, yeah, go ahead, Miriam.
Rabbi?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Carol.
Carol.
There's 2 references to the numerical hour, 3.
Yes.
3 hours of the day, and
You're
we
right.
have things to rise at 3 hours.
You're right.
So it's just here it comes again.
Yep. Absolutely. All right, Jeff, pick up with the Gemara.
What does it mean between techelet, sky blue, and white? If you say between a pile of white wool and a pile of sky blue wool, wouldn't you also know at night as well? Rather, between the sky blue in the fringes and the white in the fringes.
Right.
It was taught by Rabbi Beau from when one can distinguish between a wolf and a dog. Rabbi Akiva says between a donkey and a wild donkey, and others say when one can see an acquaintance from a distance of 4 cubits and know him. It seems that they're, relating individual discernment on multiple levels, but all visual. And visual, obviously.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm going to hit the last line, right? That the ruling follows, the opinion of the others, which is that when one can see someone at a distance of 4 cubits, when you can recognize your fellow, standing across from you, which I think Brad begins to speak to the point you made a little while ago, right? That they're sort of moving this into a space of interpersonal dynamic, right? And the darkness is, what was the word you used again? Interiority. Interiority. Thank you. Right. Versus, right, if you can actually see your friend, a dozen feet away or not.
And it may be more than that. The last 3 words, not to only see him, but know him.
Right. Yeah.
Talking about interiority and knowing.
Yes, you're right. You're right. It's not just to see him. Good catch, Jeff. I'm just scrolling through here to see if anyone's got. Okay. All right, we're going to go a little further because we're running out of time. Okay, so now we get to a little more of a contemporary, right? So right, here's the text. They did not see one another, neither did any rise from his place for 3 days. The greatest darkness is when a person does not see his fellow and does not participate in the distress of others. They did not see one another. They did not feel the other's distress. Their senses were dulled. Neither did any rise from his place, right? And I'm going to say that, I'm going to lump this next text with it, and then we'll talk about them both, right? There was a thick darkness. They didn't see each other for 3 days. If a person does not see his fellow or does not want to see him, then there's darkness in the world, right? What
is the greatest form of abuse in interrogation? That's total isolation, visual, sensory, and separateness. And that is the one and most distressing and disrupting factor of all. Total isolation, fear, anxiety, imagination, all those things work against that individual in total isolation.
And Jack, what you just said, in the middle of this so-called plague, in the middle of this virus, don't we almost all feel similar as far as the isolation and the fear?
And the greatest recommendation of every rabbi is reach out, use Zoom, make calls, join others, family, friends, and others. And
we're all here right now together.
Right.
Yeah, we are.
Jennifer.
Imagine being in a hospital alone, where you can't see anyone or be with anyone.
I'm thinking that what's happening though is also could be that what Hashem is doing is he's placing the Egyptians in relationship to each other the way that they had been in relation to the slaves. In other words, they didn't see them, they were insensitive to their burdens as slaves, and so now they're having to experience this themselves.
Right, I mean, most of us, many of us have probably heard rabbi leaders say on countless occasions and invoke this idea, which is kind of a summary of the text we've looked at here. You know, when the rabbis are asked how dark was the plague of darkness, it was so dark that that the Egyptians and the Israelites could not see the humanity in one another, right? I'm gonna look here. We got a couple minutes. Yeah, I see a hand. Hey, let me go back. Yeah, Warren. Oh, Phyllis, sorry.
Actually, so I think what just was said and what Miriam said before, I think it's a lack of sense of empathy and a lack of being in someone else's shoes. And that creates enormous issues for a community.
Absolutely, right. Again, it's the in a way I would say it's also objectification. You know, fits into this, right? Is when we stop seeing another as human, right, or we see them as less than, which, you know, I don't. It's interesting. This Torah portion, and this is a good segue to the last text that I'm keeping hidden for a second. This Torah portion always tends to fall either on MLK weekend or the week before or the week after. And obviously there's absolutely no way the rabbis, when they came up with the schedule of Torah readings, could have ever imagined, you know, king or civil rights or any of it. But it sort of feels like they did. And I think this is maybe a nice place to end with some of Dr. King's own words to this point, really, where he says, returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. And then the part piece most of us are familiar with, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Right? So I thought, you know, sort of a fitting punctuation, you know, as we celebrated the life and the legacy of Dr. King on Monday. Any
and the poem that was recited
and the poem that was
22-year-old at the inauguration.
Yes.
Amazing.
LA girl, by the, you know, if anyone didn't know. The temple can't claim her, but we can claim her as an LA girl, right?
Right.
Well, thank you everybody for making a little time for Torah today.
Thank you.
So
Thank
wonderful
you.
to see you all.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
We will.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.